British journalism. He's been the editor of GQ since 1999, overseeing a transformation in the magazine's fortunes. He's also the acclaimed author in his own right and has penned a number of biographies, including for David Bowie, Jim Morrison, and Paul Smith. So please all join me in giving Dylan a very warm round of applause.
Hello. Can I just say that by some weird coincidence, yesterday I went to talk at the Oxford Media Society, and on the journey back from Oxford to London on the train, there was a terrible, terrible sort of noise, and then the train slowed, and we'd hit someone. Someone had thrown themselves in front of this train. And the driver came out, it was covered in blood, and the windscreen was cracked. It was. All I hope is that I get home tonight, and none. So this is going to be an event-free situation in Cambridge. Yeah.
Okay. Hopefully.
Yeah.
Nothing quite that.
Can you promise that?
I'm sure we can promise that. Yes.
Thank you so much indeed.
No, thank you very much for coming. So I just feel, just to get us started, if you could tell us a bit about. About your career path and how you sort of reached the summit of men's fashion in the UK.
Well, I don't know that I've done that. But, no, we take a lot of interns and a lot of work placement people in the magazine, and we try and take as many people as possible because I think it's helpful and it's a good thing, and it's also a way into the industry. And often they come in for a chat, and they say, how do I get on? And I always say that you have to work harder than you've ever imagined work. I mean, you have to work really, really hard. Throw yourself into things. And the other thing I say is you have to be lucky. And I think we can teach you one, but we can't teach you other. I'd been to the Chelsea School of Art, I'd been to St. Martin's School of Art, and I left, and I was a highly unaccomplished photographer. And I basically spent 2 years going to nightclubs and had a very dissolute life. And I worked in a nightclub called The Fridge, and my sort of, but when you're in that zone, your sort of world shrinks, and so you try and make your day as short as possible. It's a terrible thing when you're young. I think I was about 21. And my day consisted of getting up as late as possible in order to only have one meal. And then go to a nightclub, and that's basically what I did. Because I wanted to be a photographer, but I wasn't very good. And then a friend of mine who was taking some pictures for a magazine called ID called up and said, what are you doing tomorrow? And as I had nothing to do but get up very late and go to a nightclub, I said I wasn't doing anything. And he needed someone to interview the people that he was photographing for this magazine. And in those days, the questions would have been as puerile as, where did you buy your socks and how much do you hate Margaret Thatcher, And then I duly handed this work in, and a couple of weeks later, when the editor eventually found me, because I didn't have a telephone, he offered me a job, and then I started and realized quite quickly that I never really wanted to do anything else, and sort of fell in love with the idea of journalism and print and magazines and that whole sort of very intoxicating world.
Thank you very much for that. So how does one go about interning at a place like GQ then?
You just send me an email.
Okay.
No, I mean, I'm serious. We try and take a lot of people, and we had, I think, there are certain issues these days about whether or not it's exploitative, but we try and take as many people as possible. We had one guy, I'll call him Andy because that was his name. Andy came in as an intern, and he was borderline annoying. Andy would he would volunteer for everything. And it got to the stage where whenever we needed something done, and something that maybe someone else didn't want to do, we'd say, well, just get Andy to do it. And then one day Andy wasn't there because Andy had finished his contract, his 6 months was up. So I said, well, get Andy back, which you're not allowed to. So you sort of walk Andy around the building and he comes back again. And then eventually he goes here, he goes here, he goes there, and he ended up editing our website. He's a professional editor now, works for many people, and he's got a thriving career. And that wouldn't have happened unless he'd have got that foot in the door. The problem for us, and I was discussing this with some people this morning about internships and mentoring, is that the pool that we get to choose from is so small now. When we have jobs and we hire a lot now because we're doing a lot of video, we need different types of expertise. Where eventually, when I'm asked to choose all the people that have been filleted down, they're the same people. They're usually incredibly bright, very well educated, but they're white, they're middle class, they were privately educated, and that's great. But you need other input, and it's kind of unfair as well. So we're trying to start a mentoring program which kind of leaps back, because by the time people go to university, it's kind of over. Their lives are going off in different directions. It makes me sound like a great humanitarian. I'm not, trust me, but it is a problem, because media is delivered by particular people who have had particular upbringings, and you need that diversity.
So on the point about Andy's going on to be in digital media, obviously in this age, we're moving sort of away from print and more into online, especially our generation. And how have you and GQ navigated that pathway of the past?
Like everybody else, with great difficulty and great enthusiasm and great fear, because the world has changed. And I think that if there are two fundamental things that have happened to journalism in the last 10 years, the first is that journalism has been devalued and denigrated to such an extent that it's not taken seriously, that journalists aren't paid properly, that people who run big tech organizations think that you can just fill stuff with content. People are called content providers now. That's so rude. And the other thing is that obviously the delivery systems have changed so much. That's fine. That's kind of exciting and intoxicating, because that's advancements, that's change, that's progress, and you deal with it. And it's actually made our jobs far more interesting, because you're working in ways which you weren't working 10 or 15 years ago, where on the one hand we're producing, if I talk too much, just tell me to shut up and interrupt me, because I can bang on about this stuff for ages. Because on the one hand, you're trying to produce a magazine which is incredibly intricate, complex, beautifully put together, incredibly expensive, photography, great writing, great columnists, etc., etc., etc. And on the other, you're punching out material on a sort of hourly basis on a website that constantly needs feeding. And even though the two disciplines are not that difficult, it's not that different, because it's like working on a newspaper and a magazine, you're kind of doing everything at once. So it makes for a very intoxicating environment. I deliberately stopped there so you could ask me another question.
So, I mean, following on from that, obviously online allows you to reach out to a much larger audience, but how do you go about ensuring that you're actually reaching out to the kind of person GQ wants to reach out, or is it about adapting to increase to provide more content, or still maintaining sort of GQ
Maybe
values?
that's a very pertinent question. I was discussing it with the journalist I was talking to before this. If you start tailoring your content just in order to get more readers or more viewers, you're just producing clickbait. It doesn't, I mean, obviously, we have a lot of data people that we employ now, as well as journalists and editors. But they're to help support what we do. They're not there to say, well, if you did a piece on X, or if you nuanced your political opinion slightly in this direction, we'd get more. I mean, that's crazy. That way madness lies. You use the technology to better advance what you're doing, and we can't compete with Google. Who can? But what we want to do is use the technology to create a bigger pool of our very specific customers, consumers, readers, viewers, call them what you like. Because we can't, it's impossible for us to deliver or compete on the scale of Google, but we deliver very literate, very smart, very educated, very savvy, very forward people. And that's a very interesting demographic, and it's also a very interesting demographic for our advertisers and our commercial partners.
So how has the demographic changed then that you're still targeting over the past sort of 20 years?
Well, I've always looked upon the consumer in the way that an editor of a national newspaper would, whereas if you can get them young, you keep them forever. And it's our job to encourage entry-level consumers, younger people, and also not to lose the older ones. A more fundamental problem is getting people to buy your product, because there is this assumption that content, that news, that journalism is somehow free. Again, this is something that's been exacerbated by Instagram. I mean, Instagram, on the one hand, is an incredible tool, but on the other hand, all these images are just reproduced millions of times a day, and the people who actually organized them, paid for them, originated them, took the photograph, etc., they're not getting paid. That's a terrible abuse of copyright, an appalling abuse of copyright, which is something the tech companies still can't get their heads around. I talk about this a lot, and I often think of arguments when I had with my daughters, where I'd be going out to the cinema with my wife, and they'd be in their respective bedrooms on their laptops going, "Where are you going?" And I'd say, "We're going off to see a film." And they'd say, "What?" And we'd tell them, "No, I've seen it, it's rubbish." And of course, they've stolen it. They've already watched it on their laptops. And in their eyes, there's nothing wrong with that. It's the same as me using a cassette recorder to tape something, tape a record from the radio when I was 12 years old. It wasn't because it wasn't in the social media landscape. It had slightly different bearing, but that's a huge issue. It's a huge existential issue which this industry is wrestling with, and it is in no way looking like it's going to be solved in the near future. It's a huge issue.
So if we move then, thank you very much for that. Could you talk about the state of maybe men's fashion or British men's fashion at the moment in the UK?
Well, the fashion industry is in rude health. The fashion industry contributes more to the GDP than the car industry does. It's enormous. And I've worked very closely with the British Fashion Council, and one of the things that we try and articulate and try and publicize as much as possible, that it's a business. The clue's in the name, it's the British fashion industry. It's a business. And it's enormous. And not only is there more creativity in this country than in any other fashion capital of the world, but there are businesses here now too, and they're big businesses. So it's in rude health. They have the same challenges that everyone does. Many people are concerned about the complexities of Brexit in terms of tariffs, etc. But in terms of creativity, and I'd say in terms of business, we're in a pretty good state.
So how do you think the industry itself could go about maybe improving its image in terms of getting the respect that maybe the automobile industry would gather?
It's by continually banging the same drum. It's by sending the same message. But like most things, the best examples of success. You take someone like Christopher Bailey, who was the chief creative officer of Burberry, for instance. That's a huge global success, in the same way that Gucci is in Italy, or Ralph Lauren or Calvin Klein is in North America. There is a very important symbolic companies, and the fact that Burberry is a global company is incredibly powerful.
How would we go about? How would you recommend sort of going about improving maybe British labels, because obviously like Italy's maybe seen as a heart of the fashion world. But
Well,
you've often spoken...
I mean, you say that. That's based on what? It's based on...
Perception?
It's an historical assumption. And actually, if you look at the... if you look at the fashion capitals of the world, if you show in Milan, you're showing in the most boring city in Northern Europe that isn't in Germany. If you're showing in Paris, you're showing in the most bourgeois, old-fashioned city in Europe. America has a lot of money, but it has very thin talent. London, and it is London, I'd like to be able to say Sheffield or Manchester or Norwich, but it's not, it's London, is the creative centre of the fashion industry. And it has been for quite some time. It hasn't always been as good as business as it is now. But yeah, as I say, it's in rude health.
And what advice would you give to maybe up-and-coming designers who, because I think it's quite a competitive area, almost saturated with talent, and but also that makes it harder to find a way through. So what advice would you give to up-and-coming designers to make that breakthrough?
I don't think they need any advice. I think there are great, there are great creative institutions, fantastic art schools, fantastic fashion colleges. There is now far more of a sort of vertical line in terms of developing a business. There are far more opportunities than there used to be 30 years ago. Plus, we deal with a lot of young designers, and they are so more business savvy than they were 20 or 30 years ago. Because they understand that it has to be a business. It isn't just making funny clothes and being photographed by trendy magazines. It's all about a business. We run a big fashion fund where we give £150,000 every year to a young designer, along with a lot of mentoring. And even though these are very small businesses, they understand they might not understand the minutiae of what a business needs, but they understand that they need to balance the books. And a lot of these designers are spending as much time on the formulation of their brand as they are designing, which is important.
So you've mentioned they're more business savvy and their skill sets are perhaps a little more diverse. I think, is that something you've tried to do and expand in your reign as editor of GQ, looking into different fields rather than just fashion, where fashion intersects with politics or sport? Or
I think the reason that the brand has survived is because it covers a wide variety of different subject matters, culture, politics, current affairs, as well as the sort of more sort of glitzier side of things. But and it's also having a point of view. I think that particularly at the moment where everything is available on a telephone and everything is reproduced to such an extent that it's difficult to find the veracity of a story, plus the accelerated way in which we consume information. Obviously, you're only really seeing a headline or a paragraph, or the amount of words that can fit on the front of your telephone. That's dangerous. And I think that you need, that's why talking earlier about this return to respect for expertise. And I think you're beginning to see that because the world is just awash with stuff. And you need to be able to trust journalism. You need to be able to trust journalists. And that an appreciation of expertise is something that I think you're beginning to see a lot more of, which is good and is encouraging for our industry, even though we're challenged by so many other issues, particularly technology and intellectual theft.
Speaking of challenges, what's been the most challenging or interesting photo shoots that GQ has done in your time?
The ones I can't tell you about, actually. The ones where people misbehave.
Or one you found particularly interesting?
Actually, I'm trying to think of there are. I can't actually, because I'm sure this isn't Chatham House rules, and it's I can't because I would be sued for slander. So ask me something less interesting.
Okay. Sorry. Do you feel that sort of GQ seen as a gentleman's magazine, do you feel it informs gentlemen's fashion or reacts to current changes in fashion?
I don't think it is a fashion magazine. I mean, we produce a fashion magazine twice a year called GQ Style, but I think the idea of, I think GQ is a logo, it is a brand now. I don't think people really associate it with Gentleman's Quarterly. You do, because you've done your research, but I don't think that's part of the appeal. I think it's a cultural artifact. And I think that you buy it because you, as I was saying earlier to the journalists, I was saying, all we have is our taste. That's the only thing that people are interested in. Most of the things that are in our world are accessible by anybody, but it's how we choose. It's curating, it's editing. That's the only thing we have going in our favour. And thankfully, enough people like our choices in order for us to have a very successful business. But it's about taste.
So then, you mentioned earlier about getting people when they're young. So what steps have you taken to maybe target sort of a university demographic, which is obviously maybe a little bit younger than the main readership for you?
Just by dint of what we do. I mean, there's a certain amount of outreach, but marketing is incredibly important, always, but social media has almost taken the place of marketing. And I don't think you can force yourself upon people. If people like what we do, it's up to us to have a constant churn, a constant regeneration. And I think that it's... lots of publications, lots of brands go out of business because they get lazy or they get complacent and they forget that consumers change. And also consumers these days are, they're spoilt for choice and they are very, very judgmental, as they ought to be. And there's so much transparency now. And again, you're seeing this in food supply chains, you're seeing it in the beauty industry, you're seeing it everywhere. And people are very, 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 they're very judgmental, and they need to know that the brands that they have a relationship with, particularly a consumer relationship with, they need to know that they can trust those brands. Whether it's a breakfast cereal, whether it's a type of tyre you use on your bicycle, the clothes you wear, or your phone, all of these things. And reputation matters more and more and more, as it should do.
So in an environment where you're so spoilt for choice, how do you build up that reputation or that trust with the readership?
By your content. And it sounds terribly pious and pompous to say so, but it's about content, and it's taking pride in producing the very best content that you can. It'd be very easy, it'd be much easier not to, let me tell you, and cheaper. And that's the other thing. One of the most important things is making sure that journalists are paid properly. We pay more than anyone in Fleet Street. We pay a lot of money for our journalists. Because we take pride in that, but also if you don't pay people, they're not going to be valued in that way. I can't tell you how dispiriting it is to see what's happened to the journalistic trade. It's been really diminished in the last 20 years.
Do you think perhaps current world events, like maybe the way sort of the media is attacked in America, for example, has informed the treatment of journalists here in the UK as well?
I think what's happening in the world now is so extraordinary, and it's such a rich, deep fantastic time to be operating as a journalist because there's so much going on. We live in such sort of fractious, anxious times. And we saw so much more engagement after Brexit and then after Trump because everybody wants to be part of the conversation. Everybody wants to consume information. Everybody wants to consume comment. Everybody wants to consume opinion because nobody knows what the hell's going on. And the things we do understand are very frightening. As we're living in a binary age, and it becomes, I think that people are looking for nuance. They're looking for sense. I mean, not just for us. I mean, from everywhere, from trusted news organizations. And you want to be able to offer that. And also, you're part of the conversation yourself.
You've had a very strong focus on politics in GQ, I think being the first magazine to actually shoot David Cameron after he was elected, and also with the Jeremy Corbyn photo shoot. How important do you think politics is to fashion?
Well, in some respects, they're mutually exclusive, but they are. Politics is a component of our. I always look upon what we do as a newspaper anyway. In terms of the commercial aspect of the magazine, we are driven by the luxury goods industry. Thank you very much. And fashion is a component of the magazine in just the same way that culture is, or entertainment, or tech, or sport, or food, or cars, or indeed politics. I think politics is a fantastically fertile environment, and it's fun, and it's dangerous. And actually, talking to politicians is really, you sort of can't go wrong, because if you're dealing with a Hollywood celebrity, I mean, a lot of them are ghastly, ghastly creatures. And they, as you know, you've had so many great people here talking, they are protected by this sort of, phalanx of just awful, awful people who are paid to say no, basically, in very, very different ways. And politicians can't afford to do that. Politicians thrive on the oxygen of publicity. And so you ask them a question, and they'll answer it. Whereas lots of celebrities won't, because they're trying to build a particular image or something. But I think, and also people are engaged. I mean, my daughters are probably more engaged at their age now, they're 18 and 20, than I think I was at that age. People are engaged, and they want to learn, and politicians should be available to talk to, and the more people discuss it, the better, really.
But do you think this increased level of engagement has fragmented the base and increased sort of polarization of views? And if so, how does GQ manage to keep people on both sides happy?
Well, I don't think we do. I think we're living in a world now where politics is becoming increasingly polarized. I think you have to be an idiot not to understand that. But I think the way that we reflect that is the same the way that everyone does, often with horror. And I think that we're all trying to understand the way that the world is diverging at the moment. But it does makes for sort of rich comic territory too. I mean, you couldn't, even though in many respects the idea of Donald Trump is ghastly and horrific, you couldn't wish for greater comic material. I mean, it's an extraordinary time to live in. It really is. Worrying, but kind of extraordinary at the same time.
Thank you very much for that, Dylan. So I'm going to now open up to the audience. So if anyone has any questions to inform the discussion, just raise your hand and wait for a microphone to come to you. Okay, so the gentleman just right there at the back.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, Dylan. As someone who's worked a little bit in the digital marketing space myself, how you talked a little bit about content becoming more ephemeral. How do you deal with playing up between magazine journalism and staying true to your roots, but also producing content at the same time that is constantly changing, readership on the web, basically, how we need fresh new content all the time, and also the financial implications of creating content is quite expensive. How does that work in GQ? And that's basically what I'm asking.
I think I understand your question. How do we do it? Well, just by working incredibly hard. I mean, on the one hand, you can conceitedly say, well, there's not much competition out there. But on the other hand, everything is competition. I mean, everybody with a telephone is competition. And you're fighting for eyeballs all the time. And you've got to drive that through your content. Yeah, completely. That's the only reason we do what we do.
Yeah.
It's literally the only reason we do what we do, because we take great pride in producing our content in the same way that I'm sure everyone here takes great pride in what they do. And in this day and age, I don't think there's any other way of doing it.
I was more thinking about sort of clickbait type, list type content. Do you think this is sort of devaluing some of the journalism that you possibly were doing in the past in GQ?
Well, it has. I mean, it serves a purpose, and everybody understands the nuances of clickbait. But if that's all you do, and you do it solely, then you turn into BuzzFeed, or you just talk. It's photographs of cats and city lists and things like that, which are sort of entertaining for 14-year-olds. But also, your advertisers won't follow you, and your consumers won't follow you, and you don't grow. It's a very sort of reductive spiral, I think. Sorry, you are forcing me to sound very pompous, and I blame you.
Yeah, gentleman just next to him.
Just kind of following on from that question, obviously you have a lot of blogs nowadays like BuzzFeed or Vox, etc.
Sorry, can you speak up? I'm a bit
sorry.
deaf.
Obviously now you have, in today's world, a lot of blogs like Vox and BuzzFeed, as you mentioned. And following on from that question, I don't know if you've ever read the book by Ryan Holiday about the way some big news networks use blogs sometimes to get news, and whether you think that's actually prevalent in the media, where you say you have the New York Times who need to get a quick news article, so they'll look to Vox, where Vox got it from another blog, and it's bottom to top rather than top to bottom, and whether you think this is actually a problem in the global market at the moment.
If you're talking about theft, I mean, I think that I don't think that anybody should be abused in that way. I think that
no, sorry, not that it's theft. It's that the news is bad, as in like it's not being reported correctly from the bottom, and it filters right to the top, and it's just a repetition of fake news from bottom to top.
Well, that is a vicious cycle, which unfortunately is systematic of the way that we consume information these days. But I think that you mentioned the New York Times. I mean, the New York Times is one of the greatest news institutions in the world, along with the Guardian and the Washington Post and the Times, etc., etc. And you can only continue to be a standard bearer if you have if you adhere to best practice. I mean, it's as simple as that.
Sorry, just this gentleman over here.
So I understand a lot of interviewees will come to the interviews with an agenda. So like, for example, Johnny Depp, I think you recently interviewed him and he wanted to kind of debunk some myths from a Rolling Stone article quite recently. So I was just wondering how influenced you'll be by the sort of agenda of the interviewee when you're interviewing them, if that makes sense.
Well, you can't be, is the short answer. I mean, we were offered Johnny Depp, and we were very much in two minds about this. And I spoke to the person who was looking after him, and I said, well, look, if Johnny Depp will answer all of our questions about everything from the allegations of abuse to his relationship with Amber Heard, to his allegations about the producers of the Pirates movies, all of these things, then sure. And we kind of left it at that. And actually, we weren't expecting a call back. And they called back and said, no, he'll do that. You ask the questions, and he'll answer them. So we start getting into battle mode, and we rally the troops, and we sent a journalist and sent a photographer and did this whole thing. And actually, apart from one article, which was an issue of contempt about 3.5 years ago, it's probably the piece that spent longest with the libel lawyers. It was I think it was being read for about 8.5 days. It's a great piece of journalism. He was very robust and not defensive at all, because he doesn't feel like he has anything to be apologetic about. And so, yeah, I mean, so we think it's, we weren't taking his side. We were allowing him to give his side of the story, because I don't think it's right that people should be guilty until proven innocent. But it was a very contentious thing to do, but I think it's a good piece of journalism. But the short answer to your question is absolutely no way would we allow the person that we're interviewing to be prescriptive about what we were talking about. You just can't do that. You can if it's unimportant. Yeah, I mean, that's fine. That's if it's not important. But when it's someone like this, and there is a sort of miasma of there is a sort of complex number of issues that they're sitting in the middle of, you can't ignore that. Well, we can't. It would be pointless, I think.
Sorry, just the person over here.
Hi.
Hello.
I was just wondering, in your 20 years as editor, has the evolution of the term gentleman proven to be a challenge for you? And
well, the weird thing is, I mean, we were talking about this earlier. It's probably more important in a symbolic way to be a gentleman now than it ever has been before. And when the magazine launched, I mean, it's a very archaic idea, Gentleman's Quarterly. As I'm sure most people don't even associate that with GQ. They just think it's a brand. And I'm sure when we launched, I think we'd probably launching in a culture where that wasn't sort of overly populated by gentlemen, actually. And then, because we were sort of born in the yuppie era, and then we went through the sort of 90s era of Britpop and lads mags, etc., etc. But again, I think being a gentleman is just being a good person, being a good man. I think that we're just about to publish our 30th anniversary. And normally we would use an anniversary as an opportunity to beat our chests and to show people what we've done and how amazing we are, and great photo shoots and great interviews and great scoops and things. And we've done that in the past, and we're sort of very proud of our legacy. But A, we've done that. And B, it doesn't feel like the right time to do that. It doesn't feel appropriate either. So instead, we commissioned a piece of research from YouGov about men. And often, when people do this, it's usually done for expedient editorial or expedient commercial reasons. And I actually genuinely think that, not post Me Too, but since Me Too started, I think that there's a real opportunity to talk to men, to find out what they think what they think about themselves, what they think about their peers, what they think about their parents, and to talk about everything from gender pay gaps to mental health and lots of things that actually men don't talk about. And it's a fascinating piece of research. There are some very good things in it and some very worrying things in it too, but we're going to be publishing that in our 30th anniversary in 3 weeks' time. But those are the interesting topics. I think what are the constituent parts of a man these days? I think the idea of the gentleman is a very old-fashioned and outmoded idea. It's a very old-fashioned word. But actually, as I said, I think that being a gentleman now is probably more important than it's ever been.
Just right here at the front.
Hi. I was wondering, you talked a bit about social media and stuff earlier. How do you find, as a magazine, which obviously to a certain extent has to use celebrities, have them on the cover and interviews and stuff, how have you found keeping track of where celebrities are, who, you know, different demographics have different celebrities now, the whole culture's expanded. There could be a YouTuber who a 13-year-old's obsessed with, but the rest of the world hasn't heard of. Is it hard for you as a magazine to necessarily know where and who is the sort of hot celebrities at the moment?
You have to choose by gut instinct. There will always be a number of people that you're interested in who are perhaps reluctant to do press, who are unobtainable, who have sort of an eccentric quality to them or an esoteric quality to them. But yeah, you edit by gut. You think, well, that's an interesting thing to do. Let's do them now. I mean, we put Jeremy Corbyn on our cover nearly a year ago now. And that was it's not an obvious thing to do for a glossy magazine, put a picture of Jeremy Corbyn on the cover, let me tell you. So it was a risk. Commercially, I thought it was a risk, but editorially, I thought it was the right thing to do. And it turned out to be our biggest seller of the year. And I think it's because people are interested in the idea of Jeremy Corbyn. So I don't think we were selling to people I think we were selling to all kinds of people who thought he was the person who could turn water into wine, and those who were far more suspicious. But it worked, and it worked in terms of PR. It was a fantastic interview. Not great pictures, but it kind of didn't matter in the end. It just seemed to be the right idea at the right time. So I think you have to go by your gut. I think if someone says, oh, Ryan Gosling's just called up and he'd love you to do an interview with him, it's like, which never happens, by the way, you'd probably jump at the chance. But no, you kind of have to pick and choose. And you can't pick that 13-year-old pop star that is suddenly got a huge growth spurt, because it means nothing in the wider context, and our readers are not going to be interested in that. I wouldn't have thought they'd be interested anyway.
Just right here as well.
So we know like GQ is an international brand, so I'm wondering, so I'm assuming that GQ in different countries, they are sort of independent, but also to some extent collectively. So because if you want to cover, not only current affairs, but also politics, fashion, technology, so I assume each country will kind of evolve as its own kind of GQ version. So I'm wondering if there's like conflict of the local brand versus if there is the central idealism,
sure.
And maybe some insight about, for example, like how GQ in Italy or GQ in China has evolved those years, or they parted their way sometime at some point.
It's a very interesting question. I think we have 19 GQs around the world. We're published by Condé Nast, which publishes Vanity Fair, Vogue, The New Yorker, lots of other magazines. I think Vogue has more iterations than we do, but I think we're second. I think we have 19. China's our biggest market. Chinese GQ is the biggest GQ in the world. It looks nice. It's very successful. I don't know if it's any good, because I can't read it. That wasn't meant to be disparaging, by the way, but it's more a reflection on me. But the short answer to your question is, it is complicated and sometimes testing when you have a magazine in a country where media perhaps isn't as developed or as sophisticated as some other territories. And they might be lagging in terms of their ideas of sophistication. And I'm talking specifically about their representations of people, particularly women. That has become an issue, occasionally. Particularly in more sort of robust cultures like Italy, where sexuality in media terms is represented in a very different way. So you occasionally have issues, but not often. There's small nuances, really, and often it's to do with investment and the ability to do things the best of your ability, basically. So.
Right here at the front as well.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Just this was a question about sort of interested how you sort of pursued a career in writing, because given your education at Chelsea School of Art and Central St Martin's, like you clearly have always had an interest in the visual. Sort of how you sort of navigated then a career in writing, and how sort of your interest in visual culture like developed that, or influenced your career generally.
Well, I was. You're right. I studied at art school. I was all about visuals, and I think I came to this well because I have a strong visual sense. I've got a strong visual understanding, and I sort of fell into journalism by accident. And I say to people who join the team, who are young journalists, I say that journalism's like anything. It's like you are learning a craft. I don't think I can write very well, but I've learnt to be pretty adequate. And that's not false modesty. I mean, I can write quite well, but I'm not a great writer. But it's craft, and I've developed that, and I've learnt it, and I've learned it. Some people you can't train. Some people just don't have any aptitude, and you try for 6 months, and you say, just be an editor or go and do something else. Because you can't write. But it is a craft, and if you have a bit of talent, you can develop that in the way that you can if you're a photographer or a doctor. I mean, it's your ability to learn, basically. And you can learn. You don't have to be born with a divine sort of this great gift. It is possible to become a very good writer just through practicing a lot. It's like the 10,000-hour rule. If you spend a long time doing something, you're going to get better at it.
I think right at the back there.
I have a two-part question. Looking at fashion through a business lens, what do you think the fashion industry's responsibility to socially, ethically and environmentally responsible supply chain management is? And as a GQ journalist, what is your relationship to those issues?
I think that this is all about the consumer. And I go back to what I was saying earlier about there being, there's so much transparency in the world now, and people demand it. I mean, I look at my fridge at home now, and it's like Waitrose, because my daughter's like, we've got coconut milk, we've got the oat milk, we've got this, that doesn't offend this one, and this. I mean, it's extraordinary. And that's right, that's good. But in the fashion industry, it's become of paramount importance. Even 10 years ago, it wasn't. But you look at supply chains, you look at fur, you look at the use of plastic now, which is being looked at intensively, actually. In fact, we ran a piece about this last week. We are as interested as everyone else is. And it's important that everyone is discussing this. And it's not a case where, well, we can't write about that because Louis Vuitton won't like it, or we can't write about this because everyone's engaged. And actually, you're pushing people. It's a constant conversation. And if you're writing something about a particular aspect of manufacture, for instance, that will influence a designer and a company and a corporation far more than it would have done 10 years ago, because they understand that the consumers will just go off dial. They'll just move and go over here. Because it's not just about what hits the zeitgeist. It's not just what's about fashion. It's not just what's about what's trendy. It's about all of those things you're saying. And they are increasingly important, increasingly important.
In the middle, just here.
In the age of Me Too, where do you stand on publishing provocative images of women, your weekly articles with this week's sexiest women, especially given your readership is predominantly male?
We don't. We used to. I mean, 10 years ago, we would have done things like that, but we haven't for a long time. I think
2 years ago, there was...
Sorry?
2 years ago, Kim Kardashian was featured naked. Last year, Bella Thorne was.
No. No, Kim Kardashian wasn't. But we have done. We absolutely have done. But that was chiming with the culture. But we started changing a long time ago. And actually, I mean, again, we were talking about this just yesterday in the office. I think it's become a world where we objectify men more than women. And actually, in some respects, that's just as damaging. I mean, we've got a photo shoot in our 30th anniversary issue of a transgender model. This man now, a man. I'm not even sure that's the right word to use anymore, so forgive me if I'm using an inappropriate word, but I think he wants to be recognized as a man. He's got the most extraordinary body. I mean, amazing. And we were joking that we're all going to have it done too. We're going to go from men to men. I mean, he looks absolutely amazing. And we were talking about how intimidating that might be to someone who doesn't have that physique. I think all of these things are throwing up so many questions these days. One of the biggest issues, in fact, I think one of the biggest changes, and I think it's a sad change, is humor. Because at the moment, you're sort of not allowed to make light of anything. And again, I use my children as examples, because I'll say something flippant at home and they'll just look at me like I'm the devil. Because I've defined somebody by the way they look, because they're plus size. Again, I'm not even sure that I'm allowed to use the word plus size anymore. I don't know. But that sort of humor, I mean, I'm sure Paul Merton will be very good on this when he comes later in the week. But humor is a very important part of culture. And in our current climate, humor has become very aggressive, very defensive, and actually not very funny. I think that's an important thing that's changed in the last couple of years. I mean, it will change back. I think everything that's happened in the last 18 months has been very good and very powerful and very proper and very right, and it's altered the culture, and it's moved the dial, and all of these things are important. But it will change again, and it will improve in other ways, I think. There's one over here.
Following the theme of change, from a business side, how has the demands of advertisers or like other external investors changed over the years? And do you understand or empathize why?
The advertising market is far more complex these days, and it's far more sophisticated. And if you listen to the naysayers in the industry, they will say that there has been a migration from print to digital in terms of consumers, but they've not been mirrored by advertisers. Actually, that's not true. It's just that advertising has become more fractured. But it has created more opportunities. I mean, last year, we produced and directed 5 films for Gucci, which sat on all our platforms globally, all our 19 issues, and all Gucci's platforms globally. And it was a huge advertising deal for us. It was a big commercial proposition. So successful that we're halfway through the second tranche of a further 5 films. That's an opportunity that wasn't available to us 10, 15 years ago, because we didn't have the capability and we didn't have a sophisticated enough digital proposition. So these are things which didn't exist. So we may have suffered in one particular silo in print, but it's been more than replicated in other areas. And I think that these days, it's all about partnerships, and it's all about picking the right partner. I think if you work with the right commercial partner, you can sort of do anything. You know, you can look at a piece of content and go, oh, I like that. And then who paid for it is a sort of secondary issue. So I think that, I mean, our commercial department, who are a very good department, but they have slightly different ideas about this, and they sort of would like to work with lots more people. But I think if you work with the wrong brand, it does sully you, and it doesn't ring true with the consumer and your reader. And you have to try and stay as honest and as on message as you can. But I think if you work with the right partners, people who have similar brand values that you do, then there are more opportunities now than there used to be. We've run out of hands.
Any other questions? Oh, just back here, Vincent.
I'll butt around. Yeah, no,
You're not allowed to ask a question. You're wearing high vis.
I'll take it off. No, so I kind of had a question which links to things that a couple of other people have asked and also what you've been saying. So you mentioned how kind of culture, politics, things influence the magazine, and you also discussed the importance of trust with your readership.
Yeah.
Do you think that whilst culture and things have influenced the magazine, you're also influencing the culture? So obviously, you were talking about the magazine in different parts of the world. I visited Hong Kong this summer and went through Dubai, and you see all of the kind of luxury brands, and your magazine obviously epitomizes that. And similarly with like the kind of celebrity things, the endorsements, campaigns you do with Gucci.
Yeah.
And not just do you influence the culture because they respect your magazine and trust your content. So, GQ have done a piece with Gucci, therefore that is now what we're interested in.
Yeah.
But also things like you were talking about the anniversary edition, you're going to be doing things with like a study into kind of how men perceive themselves, what it means to be a gentleman. And reporting on things like that, do you think you can actually influence culture as well because you are trusted and in a position of power?
I think it would be, well, on the one hand, it would be very conceited of me to say yes, but I would be sort of disappointed if we didn't in some respects. So yeah, you hope you are contributing to the culture, not just mirroring it. And yeah, you do. I mean, we employ some very forward-thinking, visually literate photographers and stylists and fashion editors, and we employ some fantastic journalists. So you do hope that you've left a little footprint. You know, I don't know how big that is, but you do hope that you've left something.
Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you all very much for coming, and if you could join me in giving Dylan a very good round of applause.
Thank you. Thanks. Great.
Thank you very much, Dylan. So Dylan will be around for a short while, just in the dining room, just outside the bar, if you want to have a private chat with him, for about maybe 10, 15 minutes. The week ahead sees Beverly McLaughlin tomorrow, who was the Supreme Court Justice in Canada. And then on Thursday, we've got Gail Lippestadt and Paul Greengrass. Paul Greengrass obviously directed the Bourne trilogy and also is releasing a film 22nd July, which is about the Norway massacres, and Lippestadt was the lawyer for Anders Breivik, so that should be a very interesting event, so do come along. Otherwise, thank you all very much for your time, and I hope you have a good week ahead.